our perception of someone is all about our own experiences, so our own half of the circle, and we have to own that. And it's not to say that our partners don't have their own role to play. Maybe they have a challenging relationship with conflict that has been modelled to them since their own childhood. That's for them to work on. We are 100% responsible for 50% of the dynamic.
Can you remember the moment when becoming a therapist first crossed your mind and you thought, I could seriously do this? And then what led you into being interested in family psychology?
I'm sure for some people there is like one sort of aha event. And from there on in, everything changed. For me, that wasn't the case. So I worked for lots of blue chip brands in and around the London area. And my original degree was in marketing with communication and cultural studies. So a lot of sort of sociology was in there, psychology kind of was included, philosophy. So probably really sowed the seeds for what was to come later. But marketing was always really interesting to me because, the consumer psychology aspect to it. But as I sort of progressed through the ranks, there was this sort of perhaps kind of growing lack of fulfillment and sense of a lack of purpose. And then it was other factors, Harry, like practical factors, like, do I want to work for myself? And in that is all the sort of practical logistical stuff that sort of opens up and becomes a lot easier, like flexible working, what kind of business would you like to create? Where do you want to work? What are your working hours? How much do you want to charge? Like all of those sorts of things sort of suddenly become, your responsibility. And that was really exciting to me. And the kind of creative opportunities that I knew that would allow. So there was all of that. And then throughout my 20s, I'd had like one or two experiences of therapy, really positive experiences. And so when I was sort of thinking to myself, what is next? And I'd always had this deep passion for consumer psychology, the psychology of the workplace and teams and groups of people. There was just a series of things like that just over time led to a growing realization that perhaps a career in psychotherapy would be fulfilling and interesting. And it was a very sort of conscious decision to retrain as a psychotherapist, as opposed to a sort of shorter term training, like to move into a sort of straightforward counsellor role. And I didn't want to just work with the sort of science of things and the analysis of things and in academia. So that's why I didn't sort of pursue a role like a career as a psychologist, as an example. So psychotherapist for me allows me to work at depth and to work with the history and the future, the potential as well as the woundings, and to do it in a sort of long-term capacity.
What were the things you learned during the training that helped inform your understanding of what a family is and how they work at a basic level?
One of the things that the CCP course is, famous for and does brilliantly is the sort of focus on experiential learning adjacent to the academic side of things. So, you're always put into different groups, as you know, whether it's your sort of big lecture cohort, so your year group, your supervision group, your weekend group, facilitation groups, and so on and so forth. And those groups change every year. So I kind of really noticed this idea of the energy that groups take on. So the sort of psychology of the collective, which is what we're really talking about when we're looking at family psychology, feeling safe, seen, witnessed, understood. Most people really yearn for that. One of the really big focuses that I took away from the course was this idea of, yes, we need to think about the light and our potential and how we ascend, how we grow and evolve. And that's, really, really important. But we can't bypass any of the grit, the shadow, the darkness, and we need to experience all of that. So naturally, groups experience those different cycles and those different energies. And so one of the things that's really healing is when you experience, let's call it rupture, so conflict, disagreements, and you one becomes aware of maybe, a lack of tolerance for a different view, or an awareness that, your own view is very different to the views of others. And so it's, again, a really kind of lovely opportunity to be in a safe enough environment where you can express those differences and how they show up on an emotional level. So frustration, a little bit of anger, maybe confusion, feeling overwhelmed, whatever it might be. And allowing all of those energies to be held, kind of worked with, processed, and then resolved. So the amazing healing potential of being in a healthy, well-established group is not that it will be devoid of conflict, but actually that when differences arise, that often signals conflict for people, which often people run away from. No, it's actually an opportunity to learn and to grow. So that's what, for me, I really took away from the training.
When we think about the idea of family, often the first thing that comes to mind is this idea of the nuclear family. But what's a more helpful way of thinking about collective psychology as you described it?
We think of them in very traditional terms. So, there's an old phrase like 2.4 children, nuclear, as you mentioned. So mum and dad and the children that they've had together. But there are so many broader cultural influences that mean that whilst that family type, the nuclear family type, might be still the majority, there are so many different types of family that exist. Blended families, step families have been around for thousands of years. Same-sex partnerships have been around for thousands of years. But our sort of understanding of inclusion and the different needs that those different family types might have, but also what binds us all together, is very different to what it might have been thousands of years ago. But family systems, whatever the labels are, will always be and have always been incredibly important to us. Thousands of years ago, we bonded together and we grouped together because there was safety in numbers. We needed to be able to rely on each other and regulate with one another and be safe and be protected from broader threats externally. There's no different today, except that those threats might have evolved somewhat from the idea of a woolly mammoth coming to eat you in the middle of the night. So our threats are different, but ultimately our drive for safety, to belong, to be included, psychological safety as well as physical safety, are no different to what they've always been.
What does it mean to say that someone's in your family rather than a member of your community?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's to do with closeness. Feeling like someone's a member of your family in today's era certainly does not start and stop with having a biological connection with someone. And indeed, actually, I think about our sort of friendship circles. There is a saying that friends are the family that we choose. So there is something very conscious about connecting with a group of people who maybe are like-minded, are similar to us in shared values or lifestyle, for example. More traditional types of families, so with biological ties or groups of people that live together, they might not be particularly similar, particularly once the children reach adulthood in terms of their outlook, their values, their lifestyle. We diverge as we come to consciousness and move into adulthood. Some families are characterized by being very homogenous, but it's also very common for older, more established family groups to actually live very different lifestyles. So someone's moved away, someone's retrained, someone passes away and the group dynamic, shifts again. Whereas I think when you sort of talk about this idea of community, often communities come together because they have a shared sense of purpose or a connection. They place value on the same thing, like a group of people are living in the same neighborhood and they group together to protect it, to look after it, or to celebrate together by virtue of their proximity for special occasions.
Why do we talk about families as systems? And why is that a useful way of understanding human behaviour?
So I guess it refers to the kind of the academic concept that groups of people operate as their own sort of collective entity. Like, yes, they're made up of individuals, but a group of people or a family or a team in the workplace will take on their own specific energy, their own specific culture, norms, values, etc. Each system will ultimately strive for balance. So the individuals within that system will often be put into roles. So we'll often act in a particular role on a very unconscious level in our families of origin, current families that we live in, teams in the workplace, and everyone has their sort of part to play. And sometimes we put ourselves into those roles, and sometimes we're handed those roles by other members of the family.
I think that's right. And I think it's the idea that as part of the system, you necessarily affect the whole in some way.
Definitely. And it's not just a simple cause and effect. you've said something, so I responded a certain way. It's not closed like that. There's history, there's context, there's so many different sort of micro factors that impact how somebody shows up in a system, which is why we talk about the system needing to sort of strive for balance overall. But yeah, for sure, every individual has their part to play and will affect the broader system, and how that system works, of course, will sort of evolve subtly and shift over time. For example, new members joining a family group often hugely disrupt the dynamic. Think about kind of Step Up, my book Step Up, thinking about the incoming step parent is often seen as a huge threat, particularly from the children's perspective. Whether they are or not in reality, it's the sort of unconscious associations we have with someone new coming into a family system, or an adult child marrying. So parental unit now having a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law kind of come in, who will come in with their own values and ideas of what families look like and feel like, their own perspectives, norms and rituals. And I think that's another characteristic of a system, of a family system. And I suppose what we're talking about here is all of the very unconscious ways that we approach our families or the groups that we're a part of when we are conscious. And that takes a lot of time and effort and requires us to take a lot of responsibility for our own stuff, what we're bringing to that particular group. Then we have an opportunity to appraise change in a very different way. So we might start to see that change means growth, change means opportunity, change is something to walk towards rather than run from or hide from.
All of us go through so many roles. Like at the beginning, we're obviously the daughter or the son, but then as we grow up, we are the employee, and then we're the friend, or we're eventually the father and the mother, and then the grandparent. Could you talk to me about the role that you play in your first family, and then how that might go on to shape the roles you play later in life?
Yeah, and it's not just the role that we play in our first family. I suppose it's our experience of those groups. We're on download mode until the age of about 7, when our ego forms and we come to consciousness. So until the age of 7, we are just soaking up everything around us that we're taught, that we see. So we learn how to behave and how not to behave. As an example, let's think about some very kind of classical Victorian, unhelpful tropes like, children must be seen and not heard. So, as a child, you sort of learn to devalue yourself, your own contribution. The issue with that is that the child grows, and in 20 years' time, the child is not a child anymore. The child is an adult. And we're talking here in very extreme terms, but the inner child of that now adult still carries that sense of, but there's a part of me that's not acceptable, that isn't valuable, that shouldn't contribute. And so, we find ourselves in adulthood unable to speak our truth, finding it hard to take up space. Or if boundaries weren't modeled to us effectively in childhood, then as an adult, we might act out in all sorts of ways that are not healthy for the family groups that we're a part of. And again, just thinking back to this idea that, children must be seen and not heard, which is something that so many people were taught and are still taught in some cultures today. Times will change and perspectives will change, and those people will then have children themselves. And again, if you sort of don't do the work to take responsibility for the impact of the experiences we had in childhood, then it's highly likely, and we don't want something to change, we're not conscious, it's highly likely that when we have children ourselves, we will also expect them to be quiet, to be in listening mode, not to speak. We won't take into account, their views, and so on and so forth. And so the cycle just perpetuates.
When you think about a dysfunctional family, what are the common patterns that you see?
People not listening to one another, not taking time to appreciate the value that the different energies and perspectives that exist in that system. People thinking that their way is the only way, or conversely, people thinking that they've got nothing of value to contribute. So in turn, staying quiet and sitting back. You see the impact of that much more broadly as well. So how people show up in the workplace. As an example, often bosses or leaders in the workplace will unconsciously remind people of their primary caregivers, their parents. So if we've, learned to become very conflict averse in childhood, then often we might show up in quite a sort of submissive, quiet way in the workplace. Or if we were used to really like having the limelight in our family of origin, then perhaps it will be difficult for peers and colleagues to get a word in edgeways.
Each individual has their own world outside of the family as well. Not taking responsibility for the difficulties that are happening outside of that system necessarily affects the other people in your family. Bringing in, I don't know, let's say that you are overworked and you're not doing anything about that. And then you bring that into the system at home, or you have a fallout with a friend and you don't resolve that or don't do what you need to. And then you bring that into the system as well. So it's just this complex kind of melting pot of all sorts of different things that then get expressed in this system and then get passed on into the group dynamic in all sorts of ways.
It's a really good way to look at it, because it's true. Complex melting pot is what you said. I couldn't agree more. I do a lot of work with couples, and one of the concepts that I will share with pretty much every couple that I work with is almost to consider their relationship as a bit of a Venn diagram. So you sort of imagine like these sort of two circles converging. Now, the space in the middle where those two circles overlap is their relationship. And as a couple, with a couples therapist hat on, that is the focus for me. Like, that is my client in the room, their relationship. But of course, to your point exactly then, a couple does not exist in isolation. In the same way as a baby, Winnicott says a baby does not exist in isolation. It's always a sort of product of its environment and the sort of broader influences that exist around it. Going back to the sort of Venn diagram with our couples, yes, the relationship might be the focus, but the relationship is made up of the collective values, perspectives, mindsets, attitudes, personalities, characters of the two people that are part of that couple. And then thinking about, let's say, like the Mormon community or the kind of polyamorous communities where, our sort of traditional notions of what a coupling looks like or a partnership looks like are very challenged. And again, that you've got many more circles to contend with. So the system that you described becomes even more kind of complex, and really requires everyone in it to very much get conscious, take responsibility for their part to play in what is a much bigger kind of complex system that they're a part of. So, so going back to that Venn diagram, yes, focus on the collective. But you can't just focus on the collective, because you've got this bit over here that belongs to member A of the couple and this bit over here that just belongs to member B of the couple. And then everything that's in those two respective circles is also influenced by, as you said, their experience of their family of origin, their experience of prior relationships, their experience of being in the workplace, and so on and so forth. So we just don't operate in isolation. And at any one time, there are, thousands of different inputs, if you like, that will affect the quality or the sound functioning of that system.
I'm also thinking about the responsibility you might have to meet someone else's needs. So when you're in a couple, before you have children, for example, you take some responsibility for their welfare. But then when you have children, part of that is siphoned off and directed towards the children, but then you still have the responsibility towards your partner. So that becomes complex, because everyone's got responsibility to everyone else individually, but also for the benefit of the whole system.
Exactly. I mean, it's amazing, as we start sort of talking about it, it's amazing that any families or groups do function healthily and are well established, because there are so many complexities. And I think that's what you've just described is kind of goes back to an earlier point, which is when anything comes into an established family unit or a couple system, let's say, it can often be perceived as a threat. And so, like, having a baby, having children together is no different. And it's obviously, it seems odd talking about children or infants as a threat. But, of course, like, it happens all the time. It's not conscious. It's not that the child actually does represent a threat per se. It's simply that, oh gosh, I no longer have as much time with my partner. My, again, gender normative terms, but, my wife's attention is suddenly diverted, is solely focused on our little baby. And I feel envious. These dynamics are not uncommon. And the only way around it is not to ignore it or to brush it under the carpet, but acknowledge it, bring it into the light, talk about it and process it. Some of the kind of healthiest partnerships will talk about this stuff. They won't just sort of have a tolerance for the gloss, the lightness, the positivity, oh, let's go for dinner on a Friday night, darling, and let's go on holiday next week. It will also be, what's on your mind? How can I help? Talk to me about what's troubling you. Something's been off the last few weeks. Let's talk about it. You know, as the old saying goes, a problem shared is a problem halved. But if people feel unable to sort of talk to their partner in the first instance about whatever might be going on for them, that's when, you know, a great therapist in the background to sort of help, support, reframe, gently challenge, help that person to become self-aware enough that they can develop the strength to go back into the relationship at a point that works for them, and saying, oh, I have been struggling with this thing. Let me talk to you about it, because I actually think that by doing so, it could really benefit us, and be wonderfully healing. So again, it all comes down to getting conscious and taking responsibility.
It seems like talking to your partner would be a relatively straightforward thing to do. And you both recognise the benefit of doing that on a regular basis to maintain a healthy relationship. So why is it that people find that so challenging?
Many, many different reasons. We're talking here, I think, in the realms of unconscious communication. So who does our partner remind us of unconsciously? So who they might become to us in the relationship. We're also talking about what parts of ourselves we are unable to own. So what's in our shadow, what's unwanted, therefore what we're projecting onto our partner. You know, oh, they're just going to get angry. They're not going to listen. And then we're also talking about our own sort of internalized concepts of things like the masculine and the feminine. You know, oh, I can't talk to him. Men never listen. You know, she's not going to have time for me. You know, she's just focused on the baby, or whatever it might be. When we struggle to come into the relationship and share with our partner, the easiest thing in the world to do, and you know, and you'll hear this all the time, and I hear it all the time as a couples therapist, is or with individual clients, is to blame. You know, and to blame someone else. I can't talk to her, she won't listen. I can't talk to him, he'll just get angry. I can't talk to them, they won't understand. But it's reductive, because by taking that approach, it is a very arguably lazy way to sort of participate in a relationship, because dynamics are always co-created. And as I sort of alluded to at the start of the answer to this question, often our perception of somebody, so who they are to us, who they become, why we might be frightened of them or some parts of them, why we may be attracted to some parts of them but not others. Our perception of someone is all about our own experiences, so our own half of the circle, and we have to own that in order for change to occur. And it's not to say that our partners don't have their own role to play. You know, the partners who are accused of, you know, not listening, maybe they have an aversion to conflict. Okay, so that's for them to deal with. The partners who resort to extremely defensive behaviours, anger, name calling, maybe they have had a very challenging relationship with conflict, or maybe they have a challenging relationship with conflict that has been modelled to them since their own childhood. That's for them to work on. So it's not to say our partners don't have a role. We are 100% responsible for 50% of the dynamic. So the idea of blaming the other, it's really easy, really tempting. It's a shortcut. It kind of alleviates us from our own feelings of discomfort, the onus to do some work ourselves, but it's never the whole picture.
I think you struck on something interesting there, in this idea of cycles of blame, parent and child, or the partner or the whole family blaming each other. And in order for things to be resolved, that cycle of blame has to be arrested or seen for what it is.
There is such a rise these days in sort of people bandying around very complex terms. I'm thinking of things like boundary setting or gaslighting. We have to be careful, right? Because there are some behaviours that people are on the receiving end of. People are in very challenging situations. And so as a therapist, for someone to sort of come in and sort of open up and share their experience of their partner, or share some of the things that might have been going on, the armchair psychologist might say, very unhelpful, don't blame, what's your role in all of this? But we know as therapists, actually, just to sort of be able to open up, to confide, to name what's been going on, it might be the first time that someone's ever done that. They might be acknowledging, not to you as a therapist, but really to themselves, oh, this is the environment I am living in. And so in that instance, we wouldn't instantly go to, right, let's not blame others. How can you take responsibility? But what we would also uncover, and this is, why a therapeutic process simply cannot be done as a sort of quick fix silver bullet, 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, you're fixed. The therapeutic process would have to create time and space and room to hold all of those projections, perspectives, and it would have to then very gently unpick what's keeping you there. Why are you in that situation? What prevents you from challenging? Why haven't you been able to share this stuff before? Why is this acceptable to you? Why do you find it hard to set a boundary? Why do you find it hard to challenge your partner on X or Y behaviours? So you would get there, and that would have to be a part of the work, this idea of getting conscious, taking responsibility. But we can't sort of bang that as a righteous drum from the start, because sometimes people find it very hard to extricate themselves from a relationship dynamic team group that is toxic for many, many reasons that simply can't start and stop with them having a tendency to blame others.
Why is it that major life events and big transitions tend to stir up things in people around family and identity?
You sort of named it earlier, that we as people take on many different roles as we grow and move into adulthood and place ourselves into new situations. And when roles are very established and very familiar, we are able to behave unconsciously, so they feel easier. We turn to those sort of automatic pathways that have been created for many years. So they tend to feel easier, a little bit lighter. It's a well-trodden path, as they say. But when we move through a transition into a new stage of our lives, the man becomes the husband, the team member becomes the team leader, the woman becomes a mother, the mother becomes the grandmother. All of our associations with that new role then come to bear. So, for example, the mother transitioning into the role of grandmother, don't call me granny. I'm not old. I'm not old. Or the career woman that becomes mum suddenly feels like her identity has been decimated, like absolutely lost in having to function seemingly solely for the benefit of this little tiny vulnerable being that they're responsible for. So change often for people consciously and unconsciously represents a huge threat. Going back to the idea of the team member becoming team leader, or the board member becoming the CEO. Oh, suddenly it feels like there's no backstop. Suddenly, there's no group of peers to sort of bounce things off of, to help, to offer support and guidance. Suddenly your word is the word, which can feel, that level of power for some can feel very intoxicating, but for others it can be an incredibly overwhelming experience. So when we move into these new roles, on the one hand, there might be elements of that role that we really lean towards and are excited about. There might be other parts of the role that frighten us, and that might be for many, many different reasons. So yeah, transition and change, it disrupts the status quo as well. So going back to one of the main topics of today, how we show up in groups, it's not just the impact on us as individuals that is an important dynamic here. When we go through a significant change, those changes or role changes tend to affect the groups that we're part of. So our relationships with others will need to change. For example, again, going back to the workplace, if you're a peer, then suddenly you're the boss, and you're having to sort of set boundaries, or you can no longer go for lunch with the team, whereas 2 weeks ago you were all having a glass of wine after work. It's the fear of the unknown. When we're stepping into a new role, becoming a father for the first time, being promoted for the first time, becoming a step parent for the first time. If it's for the first time, then all we have is that in our sort of awareness and consciousness really is the experience of others, or unhelpful stereotypical tropes to sort of fall back on. And when we don't know exactly how something's going to play out, then that causes us to feel very frightened. We're creatures of habit. We like familiar patterns and routines at the end of the day.
How do you approach working with someone who is stuck in a very repetitive cycle with a member of their family, in terms of how they think of them and just the behaviour kind of loops around? How do you think about starting to help them move past that?
For any therapeutic influence to be effective, there has to be a will. The person has to want to change, to want things to be different. Some people are stuck in these loops that you describe for years, for decades. Some people never get out of them. Ultimately, if that person doesn't have the will to change, then nothing's going to change. And so sometimes the role of the therapist is to kind of listen and absorb and reflect back the very fact that things don't seem to be changing, and also to sort of help kind of bring the impact of that on that individual to consciousness. Because sometimes people will say things like, oh God, I feel like I must be boring you, or like I'm bringing the same thing week after week after week after week. And so you sort of say, well, but how do you feel about it? Well, I'm bored of it. Okay, so then what would you like to change? So bringing it back to, the client or the person that you're working with at all times. And it will show up in the room. If some people say they want things to change, but they don't really mean it. And they don't really have any intention for things to change in any meaningful way. And even when people do, it can take them years to be able to affect any kind of change, because it's not just about acknowledging their own perspective and lived experience. I find this dynamic exhausting. It doesn't work for me. It's not additive. I often find myself in tears. I feel like I can't challenge that person. In front of that person, I never have a voice, whatever it might be. Often that goes on for years. So the first step of the work is to get conscious, become aware, realize the impact. And then we can look at kind of like, why don't things change? Do you really want things to change? And all of this has to happen before we can even get to a place where someone is ready to make a change. If we're talking about relationships, then I think the other very important thing here is that, again, people don't operate in isolation. So you've got the rest of the group to contend with, like the homeostasis that we talked about earlier, like the desire for things to remain exactly the same. And if there's any kind of change, the collective, so the group, the family, can swarm in and close down and, batten the hatches and make it seemingly impossible for people to, leave or behave differently or become more assertive in the dynamic, whatever it might be. In a case of a sort of romantic relationship, so again, for argument's sake, two people in this case, for someone in the system to be allowed to change, that requires the acceptance, if you like, of the other. Or do you know what? I'm really glad that you've told me that, because that thing's been bothering me too. Great. How do we tackle it together? Gosh, I'm so sorry that you've been going through that. Why didn't you talk to me about it sooner? Right. What do you need from me? How can we move things forward? How can we make you, how can you be happier in this relationship? Because I want to make it work. Like, it has to involve collaboration from the other. And often in a partnership, even when someone comes to therapy, and they might come for years, stuck in these repetitive cycles that you talked about, they might feel it is impossible for their system, their couple, their relationship to operate in a different way, because the other party simply may not want things to change. They may not have the will for things to change. They might not think there's a problem. So, then we're looking at something different potentially as a solution. But ultimately, for many, and this is where, free will for us as humans comes in, it doesn't matter really how hard something might be or destructive a relationship might be. We as therapists, we have the luxury of being emotionally detached and not in that environment day in, day out. if someone doesn't feel they have the strength to make that change, that we might secretly think, oh gosh, they'll be a lot happier. Gosh, their confidence will go through the roof if only that could happen. Ultimately, nothing will change and those repetitive cycles will continue.
What are some of the unique challenges that blended families face, and how do you approach working with them?
I think blended families face challenges at all levels. So kind of cultural level, systemic level, societal level, that's before we even get into the actual dynamics with the family group itself. So I'll just kind of go through them very, very quickly. On a cultural level, we've got the unhelpful stereotypical trope as an example of the wicked stepmother. That kind of infiltrates the collective unconscious to such a level that well before people have had any personal direct experience or lived experience of a step parent themselves, often they will, as soon as they become aware that a step parent might be coming on the scene, they instantly go to, those unhelpful, well-trodden paths and, approach that new relationship with a level of hostility. Societal level, we, again, being creatures of habit, again, finding safety in numbers, we tend to celebrate the majority. And there's no getting away from the fact, it's not right and it's not wrong, it's just a fact that the nuclear family structure that we spoke about earlier is the majority in this country and in many others. So where you have the majority, you have, great numbers of people, millions of people, holding on to those ideals, never mind at a conscious level, on a very unconscious level. So then we're into the realms of blended and step family members feeling othered on one end of the spectrum, on the receiving end of prejudice at a different end of that spectrum. And for the people that are a part of that majority, so in this case, let's say nuclear family members, what they are doing is perpetuating unconscious biases. And, and that can be felt in, any number of different ways. Then we've got the sort of impact of the broader family dynamic. And by this, I mean co-parents, other family members, friendship groups, grandparents, all have a huge influence on the healthy running of the blended or step family, from the welcoming of the incoming person to the individual's various relationships with the concept of separation, divorce in the first place, the old relationship between the couple that have now separated or divorced, how the sort of outgoing party, if you like, the now co-parent, was treated, accepted into the old family system, and therefore the remaining members of that broader family, how they, like the degrees to whether they're actually able to let go of that bond in its old form and make way psychologically for somebody new to sort of come in and establish themselves. And then, of course, we have the actual experience of the blended or step family themselves. And that can be incredibly challenging for all members. So as an example, children can feel like there's a huge threat on the horizon. Step parents can feel incredibly resentful of some of the dynamics that bubble up unavoidably and avoidably. They can feel like they're not welcome. They can have challenges with feeling like they just don't belong. And parents who once were, if you like, equal with their other half and their biological children, parents are now having to sort of pivot into a much broader role, which is not just parent, it's also partner and it's also peacekeeper. So they're sort of often put in the middle of warring step parent and child dynamic, or maybe not warring, because that's a very negative word, but they're just put in the middle of that dynamic, helping to broker introductions, helping to reframe things for the children in a way that's palatable for them, helping for both parties to sort of foster understanding and acceptance, and to encourage each party to sort of approach these new dynamics with an open mind.
What would be some things that if a couple were to come together and bring their families together into a new home, what do you think are the most important things that they should talk about and agree before they do that, or maybe strategies for helping manage the inevitable things that might come about?
I think that no subject should be off limits for a start. I think that the mindset of, I'll just use the mindset of we are forming a new family unit together, which happens to be characterized by parent, step-parent combination in this case, is very, very helpful because it helps to equalize a dynamic that, but just by nature is not equal. If you don't have biological ties to the children that are potentially living in the household all of or for part of the time, of course you don't enjoy that same level of intimacy. You can't exercise the same levels of authority. You don't have the same level of influence. Not to start with, that will come, particularly where equal or majority custody dynamics exist. But yeah, so to sort of for the couple to think about their family as a family unit, and to not sort of mentally apologize for the fact that it's not the nuclear family unit, I think is really key. And then to think very consciously about, okay, so what do we want our new family to look like, to feel like? What behavioural ideals are we going to instill in the children together whilst they're under our roof? All of those sorts of things. So for the step parent to feel like they really have a voice, and for the parent to give their partner, the step parent, permission to have that voice. All of these things are important. Then I think for the parent to work very consciously on their relationship with their now co-parents, whether that might be, again, sort of setting boundaries, agreeing things clearly, communicating effectively. And obviously that's a catch-all term. We could spend hours talking about what that might look like. But the relationship between parent and co-parent is critical. And then not to be afraid to talk about things. As we've described, children in the household, when incoming step parents move onto the horizon, feel all sorts of things. Resentment is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So again, for the parent and step parent couple team to sort of make that okay. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel resentment. It's okay for these relationships to feel challenging. Let's talk about it. What can we do? And so to just right from the start, develop this idea that the family system, the step family system that they're creating is something that they all have a responsibility to participate in and contribute to effectively, making time for the others, listening, sharing your own opinions and having that voice. So, those are just some of the things. We, again, could probably talk all day about it.
How do you think your work with families has changed the way that you think about your own?
I suppose taking the time to understand that there's always, going back to this idea of layers that we spoke about at the start, there's always so much more going on than our brains in the moment have time to process. So being able to sort of reflect on those different layers, slowing down to sort of really understand, okay, what's my role in this? How can I contribute differently? How can I do more of the things that seem to be really working and additive to that system? I think it was Jung that said that, therapy ultimately is not effective. It's not working unless both parties are changed in the process, or it impacts both parties in the process. And I think that's really important. I think it's a bit cheesy, but life's a teacher, isn't it? And so I would fold in everyone that we come into contact with. We learn something from everyone, one way or another. And so, yeah, the work that I've done, the things that I've experienced in my own family groups, the things that I've learned in an academic institution, the kind of wisdom that I sort of sit with every day from my own clients and kind of witnessing their struggles in their own environments, it's all hugely influenced me and shaped me as an individual. I'm very biased, Harry, but I think it's one of the most rewarding careers you can do.